Angela Davis is co-chairperson of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party USA, the recipient of the Lenin Peace Prize in 1979, a professor, an author, and has been a political prisoner. When she was falsely charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder in 1970 and illegally extradited from New York City to California, she read a statement in the Marion County Superior Court quoted by Bettina Aptheker in her book, The Morning Breaks, The Trial of Angela Davis. I now declare publicly before the court, before the people of this country, that I am innocent of all charges which have been leveled against me by the state of California. I am innocent and therefore maintain that my presence in this courtroom is unrelated to any criminal act. I stand before this court as a target of a political frame-up which, far from pointing to my culpability, implicates the state of California as an agent of political repression. I am proud to present Angela Davis, who will stand here and present the second annual W.E.B. Du Bois Memorial Address entitled Mayor Eddie Carthan and the Struggle Against Racist and Political Repression, Angela Davis.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Reverend Alberts for having extended the invitation to me to deliver the second annual W.E.B. Du Bois Address. I am aware that had the former mayor of Chula, Mississippi, Eddie Carthan, been released from prison, he would stand at this podium today. Therefore, I'm going to attempt as best as I can to share with you some of the aspects of his predicament, which he might have had he been able to be here this morning. And I'd like to begin by pointing out that this is an era of intensified and increased repression, racist repression, political repression. 10 years ago, it had been some months since I had been acquitted of the 3 capital charges which were filed against me. And at that time, people were aware of the names of many other political prisoners. There was at that time, for instance, there were the Soledad brothers, the San Quentin Six. There was Erica Huggins, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, David Hilliard, the Los Angeles 18, the New York 21. There was the case of Ed Poindexter and David Rice in Omaha, Nebraska. There was the Panther case in Philadelphia, and I could continue. There were the Attica brothers cases. There were the Wounded Knee cases. Of course, during this period, at least according to the established media, it is not as important to be informed about what is happening inside the prisons, about what is happening as far as those who are struggling for progressive and radical change is concerned, those who continue to be at a perhaps even to an even greater extent today than 10 years ago, continue to be victimized by political repression, that this is something that's not important. But considering the fact that this is an era during which the overall social and economic conditions of this country have deteriorated in a devastating way, thanks to the assault that has been led by the present president of this country, Ronald Reagan, and when we consider that millions of people across this country do not have jobs, when we consider that millions of people in this country do not have jobs. Is this better? Is the microphone working at all? Or it's this one right here. Okay. Now, is this better? I will try. As I was saying, literally millions of people throughout this country today do not have jobs. Many are losing their unemployment compensation. Many are losing their homes. Many are losing their cars. Many are being thrown out into the streets and turned away from shelters. Many find when they line up in the cheese lines or soup lines that by the time they get there, all of the food is gone. And of course, while the situation of the masses of working people in this country is deteriorating, there is an ever-increasing effort on the part of the Reagan administration to channel more funds into the Pentagon to further escalate what is already an insane nuclear arms race. Within this context, racism is on the rise. The Ku Klux Klan, the Nazi Party, other hate organizations throughout this country are not only advocating genocide against black people, people of color, Jews, but are actually carrying out acts of murder, acts of violence. 10 years ago, there was a great focus on the crimes committed by police departments across the country. Perhaps some of you will remember that it was thanks to J. Edgar Hoover that police departments throughout the country agreed in collusion with the FBI to attack such organizations as the Black Panther Party with pretexts that were flimsy if they existed at all. Today, the level of police crimes has increased tremendously. And as a matter of fact, not very long ago, the National Alliance held a police crimes inquiry, a national police crimes inquiry, and we were astounded ourselves that there has been such a marked increase in the numbers of murders of innocent people, particularly young black people murders and assaults. This is the era in which we live. It is an era in which the prisons are becoming even more overcrowded. Death row, indeed, holds now approximately 1,100 people, 42.8% of whom are black. And if something is not done about challenging the death penalty, we will be witnessing in the very near future people being herded into electric chambers and electric chairs and gas chambers and being injected. They have this new form of making the death penalty more humane, they say, by injecting people with a poisonous chemical. Well, I was thinking as I reflected upon the situation of those who are victimized by the judicial and penal system in this country, that when W.E.B. Du Bois was arrested, he made the following statement. He said, "What turns me cold in all this experience is the certainty that thousands of innocent victims are in jail today because they had neither money, experience, nor friends to help them. The eyes of the world were on our trial, despite the desperate effort of the press and radio to suppress the facts and cloud the real issues. The courage and money of friends and of strangers who dared to stand up for a principle freed me. But God only knows how many who were innocent as I and my colleagues are today in hell. They stagger out of prison doors embittered, vengeful, hopeless, ruined. And out of this army of the wronged, the proportion of Negroes is frightful. We protest and defend sensational cases where Negroes are involved, but the great mass of arrested or accused black folk have no defense. There is desperate need to oppose this national racket of railroading to jails and chain gangs the poor, friendless, and black. W.E.B. Du Bois made this statement in 1951. He might very well have been talking about 1983. When we consider that only a couple of weeks ago, Eddie Carthan was transferred to one of the most notorious prisons in the country, Parchman State Prison Farm. Perhaps some of you remember some of the exposés that have been done about this penitentiary. This prison has been ordered to shut its doors by a federal district judge because of the atrocious conditions. This is where Eddie Carthan is compelled to live out his days right in through here. A man who is absolutely innocent. And as you know from listening to the very moving children's story that Reverend Alberts told and reading the material that you have received, the only crime that Eddie Carthan has committed is to stand up for the rights of the poor and oppressed people of this country, black people and people of all colors. And I want to talk a little bit about the meaning of his case, of his experience. Eddie Carthan was 27 years old when he was elected to the office of mayor in that small delta town of Chula, Mississippi. I don't know how many of you have ever been to the rural South, but if you have been to the rural areas of Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama, you know that many black people live under conditions which are not very different from those which prevailed during the 19th century in the immediate aftermath of slavery. No indoor plumbing. A pump perhaps is considered to be an advance, a water pump, as opposed to one of the wells that you lower the bucket down in order to get your water. And I can attest to this fact. My father grew up in rural Alabama, and as a child, I used to visit my uncle who lived on the land where my father was born. And when in the 1960s he was able to get a water pump, that was considered to be a real piece of progress. He never got indoor plumbing, by the way. There was always the outhouse. Black people in Chula, Mississippi, at the time Eddie Carthan was elected mayor, could not even claim that they had been able to use city funds in order to have the streets in their neighborhoods paved. The majority of the streets, the roads were unpaved. They could not enjoy a recreational center. There were no health facilities and health care facilities in the towns. The houses, if it is correct to call the shelters that so many black people in those areas are forced to live in houses, were ramshackle and broken down. But poor black people are not the only ones who live in Chula. There are also those who own the plantations, the cotton plantations. There are those who own and control the banks. And as a matter of fact, if any of you have been to rural areas such as Chula, you will know that generally there is a dividing line, maybe a railroad track, it may be something else, where the black people live on one side, and then the white people who have the nice houses and the paved roads and maybe even the swimming pools in this day. Well, that's the way Chula, Mississippi looked when Eddie Carthan decided to run for the office of mayor. Why would he decide to run for mayor? Many young black people today have grown up in those areas, and they've gone to high school, after which they've gone to college, and then after they get a degree, they move elsewhere. Maybe if they remain in the South, it might be in some of the larger urban areas. Perhaps they'll leave the South. Well, Eddie Carthan decided, after he received his master's, that he was going to go back home. He was going home. He was going to utilize the knowledge, the skills he had acquired during the course of his education, not only to benefit himself but in order to ensure that the plight of his people, all of his people, might be improved. When I first heard about the case of Eddie Carthan, I was somewhat reminded of Dr. Du Bois, who, although he did not grow up in the South, of course, decided after having completed his education to go south to help his people. Well, Eddie Carthan was responsible for some very important and very rapid transformations in the town of Chula. As a matter of fact, he was able to attract funds, and he got grants and CETA jobs. Streets began to be paved, housing began to be weatherized, a child care center was established, a health care center was established. And the ruling interest of Chula, said, what is this? What is going on? That is not the way. Well, first of all, the mayor was not supposed to move independently, but rather to take orders from the plantation owners and the banks. That's the way it had always been, probably since Reconstruction. And second of all, it was a black mayor doing this. Well, they tried to get him to resign. They put pressure on him to resign. Eddie Carthan did not resign. As a matter of fact, he knew what he was confronting when he decided to run for mayor. Eddie Carthan is someone who grew up in the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, he was arrested for the first time when he was 12 years old. So he understood that it was going to require a tremendous amount of perseverance and courage to stand up against the racist forces of Mississippi. I don't know whether he could have understood the lengths to which they would go in order to ensure that he no longer occupied the office of mayor, because it's a strange story. And what I always say is that when I first heard him tell the story, we did a tour. We toured several major cities this summer together before, of course, his arrest in October. And when I heard him tell the story and all of the intricate details, I could not believe it. The only thing that I could think was that this was something, there's this television program that's called That's Incredible. That, that's something that really belonged on that TV program. Absolutely amazing. How could the banks simply decide to stop payment on checks of city workers? They did. The money was there. They stopped payment on the checks. How is it that a minority member of the Board of Aldermen, one who was, as a matter of fact, the opposition in the mayoral election, a man named Jim Andrews, how is it that, the Jim Andrews was the man who was appointed by the alderman to the office of the chief of police. Now, according to regular procedures, the chief of police is appointed by the mayor. And the mayor swears the chief of police in. And the chief of police must be bonded. But no, this alderman appointed Jim Andrews just like that and told him he was chief of police. And this man, Jim Andrews, takes guns and goes to City Hall. Now, what is the mayor supposed to do? Well, the mayor had appointed a chief of police, and he took the chief of police whom he had appointed to try to do something to disarm this man who had come into City Hall with guns. They disarmed him and placed him under arrest. That sounds quite normal, doesn't it? What else should he have done? But as it turns out, and if you know anything about the rural South, you'll understand this quite well too, Jim Andrews' sister-in-law is the judge. So that he was immediately released. Not only was he immediately released, but his sister-in-law, the judge, allowed him to file charges against Eddie Carthan, the police chief, and 5 others whom the mayor had deputized. Charges of assaulting a police officer. And after that, when the mayor attempted to file charges against Jim Andrews, the same judge told him, well, now Jim Andrews was immune because he had already filed charges. That's incredible, isn't it? And, of course, Eddie Carthan, the chief of police, and the 5 deputies, known as the Chula 7, were tried and convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. And this was a simple assault charge, the first time in the history of the state of Mississippi where a simple assault charge has brought about such a long prison term. But they didn't stop there. The next set of charges were federal charges. 2 men were attempting to get a bank loan. And I can't give you all of the details, but what they did was to sign Eddie Carthan's name on the papers as a cosigner. Later, Eddie Carthan was charged with providing false information to a federal bank, to an FDIC bank. And when it was pointed out during the trial that this was not Eddie Carthan's signature, that it had been written by the others, the response was on the part of those who were fraudulently claiming that Eddie Carthan had been involved in this conspiracy with them. Their response was that, well, they had called the mayor, and the mayor had told them it was all right to sign his name. Eddie Carthan was convicted on those charges and was again sentenced to 3 years in the penitentiary. They did not stop there. They did not even stop there. A man active in city politics in Chula, the town politics, the owner of a convenience store, was robbed and killed by men who came from out of town. They were tried, they were convicted, they went to prison for robbery and murder. Months later, many months later, one of them announces that actually it was Eddie Carthan, the mayor, and his brother who had instructed them to commit this murder and robbery. Last October, Eddie Carthan went to trial on these murder charges. Well, there was a different situation in October of 1982 than there had been in the year of 1981. The first 2 trials took place in Mississippi. Few outside of Mississippi, few outside of the county of Holmes County knew about what was going on. By October, a massive movement had been created all over the country. And as a matter of fact, the Alliance was able to organize a national day of protest against legal lynching in the South to coincide with the opening day of the trial, October 19th. People throughout the country demonstrated outside of federal buildings for the freedom of Mayor Eddie Carthan. And when the jury came back with their verdict, they only needed 40 minutes to decide upon a verdict. Only 40 minutes. It was, of course, a verdict of not guilty. But Eddie Carthan, of course, is still in prison. They immediately incarcerated him on the basis of the first two charges, the first two convictions, which are under appeal, and they have refused to grant him an appeal bond. Well, we must ask ourselves, why are they doing this to this one man in this small town in Chula, Mississippi? Well, it's not just a single incident. It is perhaps the most glaring example of what is an overall systematic assault on black elected officials all over this country. And when we talk about the black people's right to representation, right to the ballot, we're reminded once again that it was the great Dr. Du Bois who stood up and argued and fought for black people's right to the ballot. There was a brief period when Afro-Americans voted Afro-American men in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the period of radical Reconstruction. But of course, with the overturning of radical Reconstruction, there came about the systematic disfranchisement of black people who predominantly lived in the South. From the 1880s to the first decade of this century, all of the southern states rewrote their constitutions in order to ensure that black people would not vote. Jim Crow laws were established, and the whole process of establishing the system of segregation took place. And of course, there were those who felt that the system was so powerful that it could not or should not be challenged. There was, as we have heard, Booker T. Washington, who felt that black people should focus primarily on the economic path to liberation, vocational path to liberation. That black people should forget about participating on an equal basis in the political affairs of the country. And it was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois who challenged the Great Atlanta Compromise and pointed out that if we did not wield the power of the ballot, there would be no way that we could even begin to embark upon the path toward emancipation. During the 1960s, it was only the 1960s, only 20 years ago or so, that finally a movement powerful enough to demand the right to vote in a successful manner, the civil rights movement, led to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And finally, almost 100 years later, black people in the South obtained the right to cast their ballot. Once again, in the 1980s, this right to the ballot is under attack. Ronald Reagan did not want to extend the Voting Rights Act. He tried his best to prevent the extension of the Voting Rights Act. And when it became clear that because of the movement that had been created across this country, that was not going to happen, he wanted to make sure that, well, if it passed, it should be at least a watered-down version of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what did he propose? That you have to prove a voting official's intent to discriminate in order to charge the official with discrimination. How can you prove somebody's intent? You know, one of the things that I have said on several occasions is that suppose they move a polling booth, which they have done, away from a poor black neighborhood, and because of transportation problems, people are not able to get to the booth to vote. The voting official only has to say, well, I didn't know that they wouldn't be able to find transportation to the voting place. After all, I thought most of them are on welfare, and I thought most people on welfare drove Cadillacs anyway. You know, I mean, that's the kind of excuse that could be given according to Ronald Reagan's reasoning. Well, fortunately, we were able to prevent the inclusion of that clause specifying intent as the basis for filing charges of discrimination against voting officials. But the problem today, sisters and brothers, is that even though the Voting Rights Act has been extended, it is not actually being implemented. It is not being carried out. It is not, if you do not have a mechanism whereby you can ensure that the Voting Rights Act is respected, black people's rights will still be trampled upon. And that is happening in the South and all over. Consider the case of Julia Wilder and Maggie Bozeman, the two black women who just recently were freed on parole. And what was their crime? Well, they were voting, voter activists. They had been active in the voting rights movement for a long time. And because they had made it a practice of assisting disabled black people and those who had problems seeing or who had problems deciphering ballots to help fill out their absentee ballots, they were charged with voter fraud and sentenced to prison. Charged, convicted, sentenced to prison. A 50-year-old woman, a 70-year-old woman. Prominent activists in their community in Aliceville, Alabama, Pickens County, Alabama. Well, what are some of the other instances of the violation of voting rights and the attack on black elected officials across the country? Well, there's a case in Richmond, Virginia. The first black mayor of Richmond, Virginia was run out of office very much in the same way as they tried to run Eddie Carthan out of office. They moved to, white businessmen in Richmond moved to limit the powers of the mayor drastically. Mayor Ernest Morrill of New Orleans, who won the last election by a tremendous margin, has been pointed out as the target of a vendetta by the governor of Louisiana. Perhaps you are aware of what is happening to Mayor Coleman Young in Detroit. Perhaps you know about what has happened to Mayor Kenneth Gibson of Newark. who had 47 counts against him. And then, of course, by the time the trial took place, all except 3 counts had been dismissed. And he was acquitted on those 3 counts. There is the mayor of Houston, Texas, who is not black, who is a white woman, who was elected as a result of a coalition between the progressive white community and the black community. She had the courage, and I think we have to have a tremendous amount of admiration for her, to bring in Lee Brown, the black police chief from Atlanta, to deal with those racist cops in Houston. And you better believe that they are both under attack as well. I mean, I could go on and on talking about the assaults on black elected officials. Why is it important for all of us to stand up for the rights of black people to the ballot and to defend black elected officials? It's not just something that black people should do. It affects the vast majority of people in this country. Let me ask you one question. When you consider the Congress as it is constituted today, what body would you say is the most progressive body in Congress? The Black Caucus. Isn't that right? When you talk about Ron Dellums, John Conyers, the other members of the Black Caucus, they represent not only the interests of black people, but people of all colors in this country, don't they? And I think that it is important during this month, particularly Black History Month, to reflect upon the lessons that we can learn from the struggle for Afro-American liberation, to reflect upon the relationship between victories won in the fight for the emancipation of black people and the situation, the condition of the population as a whole, and to understand that there's a very important underlying dynamic, that each time a victory is won in the struggle for black liberation, that means the extension of rights and liberties to the vast majority of people, to all people in this country. And it means, therefore, that challenging racism, challenging racist and political repression should not be done simply on a moral basis. It should be done because it is absolutely necessary to ensure the future health of this entire country. And I think that if we do not very soon ensure that Mayor Eddie Carthan is set free, all of us will be in much worse shape than we are today. Eddie Carthan is in prison because he represents the true interests of the people of this country. He is the one who is standing up for the poor, for the oppressed. He is the one who would stand up to a Ronald Reagan who wants to see MX missiles flourish while people die in the streets of starvation. And I want to ask you, my sisters and my brothers, to participate in the struggle to free Eddie Carthan, to participate actively. Because you know, these days it is not enough simply to agree that something is wrong. It isn't not enough simply to experience the feeling of discontent, to say that Ronald Reagan and his kith and kin should be challenged. It is not enough to simply reflect upon it, to talk about it. Something has to be done about it. And there is, of course, the petition that Reverend Alberts mentioned. I hope that every single one of you will sign the petition, at the very least will sign the petition, which is directed to Governor Winter of Mississippi and President Reagan on the question of the federal charge. I hope some of you will take the petitions and circulate them and talk about this case to your friends and your co-workers. And I hope that you will point out that this is not unique, that there are many other cases involving political prisoners across this country, that in fact the executive director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, Charlene Mitchell, was recently convicted of fraudulent charges along with her husband after having been kicked off the train by police in Gainesville, charged and convicted of giving information to the enemy because he was active in the struggle to end the war in Vietnam. And Ajani Imani Harris, who sits on death row in the state of Alabama. And I hope that you will encourage your friends, your families, your co-workers to become involved in an organized fashion in these struggles. One of the things that we have learned in the Alliance in the course of 10 years of struggle is that unity plus struggle plus organization equals victory. Were it not for the fact that there was unity and struggle and organization around my case, sisters and brothers, I can guarantee you that I would be sitting in prison today. I want to invite all of you to join the Alliance, which is an organization that includes everyone, regardless of whatever else you might believe, as long as you agree that something must be done to prevent the continued rise of racist and political repression, we invite you to join us. Whether you be communist or a member of the Democratic Party, whether you be active in the church community or active in the peace community, in women's organizations or youth organizations, students, workers, whatever you may be, you can be sure that you will find someone, an individual or an organization like you already in the Alliance. And we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year with a conference that is going to take place in Chicago from May 13th to the 15th. At McCormick Inn. I would like to invite you to attend that conference. And in conclusion, I want to read a passage authored by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., a passage from his address honoring Dr. Du Bois. Dr. King says that Dr. Du Bois's greatest virtue was his committed empathy with all the oppressed and his divine dissatisfaction with all forms of injustice. Today we are still challenged to be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until every man can have food and material necessities for his body, culture and education for his mind, freedom and human dignity for his spirit. Let us be dissatisfied until rat-infested, vermin-filled slums will be a thing of the dark past, and every family will have a decent sanitary house in which to live. Let us be dissatisfied until the empty stomachs of Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of Appalachia are revitalized. Let us be dissatisfied until brotherhood is no longer a meaningless word at the end of a prayer, but the first order of business on every legislative agenda. Let us be dissatisfied until our brother and sister of the third world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, will no longer be the victim of imperialist exploitation, but will be lifted from the long night of poverty, illiteracy, and disease. Let us be dissatisfied until this pending cosmic elegy will be transformed into a creative psalm of peace, and justice will roll down like waters from a mighty stream. Thank you.